There's really no question as to whether the global reset is happening or not. The only question is, what do you do about it? How do you respond? I know that many of you are concerned about the current global situation, and many of you want to know, what can I personally do to live through this new period that we're in right now? And some of you have probably already made changes to your lifestyle, especially the digital nomads, expats, and global entrepreneurs under you. The Great Reset is the name of the 50th annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, which was held in June 2020. And what was really surprising, what happened actually, was that some presidents, some global leaders, presidents, prime ministers have responded, okay? They have formed their response in the form of a speech. I highly recommend that you watch Justin Trudeau's speech on the global reset. If we take a look at the United States, and the United States is not the only country that has this issue. In fact, many Western countries and developing countries have similar issues. But the US has the biggest debt crisis in modern history. A debt crisis is a time when expenditures are so much greater than tax revenues. And this has been going on for a prolonged time. The United States has been doing this for decades now, for decades. It hasn't just been a year or 2 years, it's been decades. The United States has been importing a lot, but not exporting much. And if you're not exporting much, and if you're not, making much from tax revenue, naturally, the national debt is going to grow more and more. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. The main problem is the lack of manufacturing, the lack of goods and services being produced in the United States. And like I said, the United States is not the only country that has this issue. European countries have the same issue. Canada has the same issues, but not to the same extent as the United States. From May 2020 to April 2021, 40% of all the dollars, okay, all the dollar bills, all the money, all the digital, whatever, all the money that's available, the entire money supply, 40% of that was printed during that period. That's unbelievable. 40% of the total money was printed from May 2020 to April 2021. The Federal Reserve is printing endless money to fund deficits. And if you've been wondering why goods and services, and also a lot of other things, but just taking a look at goods and services, if you've been wondering why food has become so expensive, like inflation rate right now is just astronomical. And if you take a look at car prices, used cars, new cars, if you take a look the year-over-year price change, it's been the highest in many, many decades. And that's a very bad sign, because your salaries, right, your business profits have probably not gone up by that much. Whatever you do for a living, doesn't matter. However, it's been a really tough time inflation-wise. Prices of used cars has surged as much as 35% over the past. And let's not even talk about new cars. In many cases, it's almost impossible to get a new car because there is a global chip shortage. And the global chip shortage resulted because a lot of manufacturing plants in China and Asian countries were closed due to the pandemic. And now we have this chip shortage, which led to a car shortage, not also a car shortage, but also a used car shortage, right? Because if people with newer cars are unwilling to sell them because they can't buy new cars, because if you want to buy a new car in the US right now or in any country, you have in many cases to pre-order it. And if you have to pre-order it, you have to pay more money, right? So many car dealers charge huge markups right now. And these markups are unheard of. Like if you had ordered a car a couple of years ago, in many cases that wasn't even necessary, because you could just go to a car dealership, buy the car there, and in many cases have it the same day. But today, buying a new car is very difficult. If you have any luck finding one, it could be very expensive, and the waiting time, could be weeks or months. And because there's so few new cars coming on the market, the people that would normally sell their cars to buy a new car, they just can't do that because no new cars are available, or they're too expensive and they don't want to pay the money, which also hurts the used car market so much. And that's why there is a shortage of used cars on the marketplace right now, which led to higher prices. So a car that cost maybe $10,000 2 years ago costs as much as $13,000 to $15,000 today. Germany was undergoing a very similar time. We're about to hit hyperinflation, okay? If you take a look at Germany in 1921, that's exactly what happened to Germany. And not only Germany, by the way, also Argentina. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the entire world. The reason why Argentina was one of the richest countries back then was because of its distinct agricultural benefits. You know, it was big in exports. But nowadays, Argentina, things have changed. But what really led to the debt crisis in Argentina was the mass printing of fiat currency, government money. The lack of economic growth, inflation, and corruption really hurt Argentina. One of the best things you can do today to make sure you're somewhat protected against inflation is to put your money into hard assets, meaning real estate, precious metals, commodities, right? Or cryptocurrencies, you know, intangible assets. That is another thing that you can do to protect yourself, because a dollar that you have today is not gonna be worth a dollar 2 years from now. The spending power will decrease more and more and more. The financial aspect of it is really important, especially inequality. Inequality is a big problem. There's never been a bigger difference between the richest in the world and the poorest in the world than there is today. There is a bunch of people that have more than $10 billion, and there's even some people that have hundreds of billions of dollars, and some of them paid zero taxes on their money. And yes, the global reset is about taking money from capitalists. It is about that. They're coming for you. One of the main talking points of the conference that took place in June 2020, which was organized by the World Economic Forum, was that they were talking about emissions. Emissions are a big problem, and you can guess why things are happening the way they're happening. Air travel is being restricted a lot, and no doubt that cheap flights are not wanted anymore because, you know, in their eyes, you know, in the eyes of the top leaders, cheap airfares are just unnecessary. You know, for them it's like, yeah, or for a lot of other people, why do you need to travel to spend a weekend in, let's say, Paris, you know, if you can spend a weekend just 10 miles away from your home? And I think one of the problems was that airfares were too cheap. It was just too cheap to fly. Anybody could fly. And the more people travel, the more often they travel, the worse it is for our environment. That is just true. That's also a big reason why they're striving to get rid of all gas-operated cars by 2050. Now, this is a very ambitious goal. I don't know how they're going to do it. I think it is kind of feasible in the Western Hemisphere, where people have more money, higher salaries. But is it going to be feasible in places like China, India, and Brazil? You know, especially China, India, and Asia in general, because that's where most people are located. It's just not very feasible to believe that each Asian will have an electric car by 2050, you know? So it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to make that happen, I think. They have the goal. I think they have a good chance of achieving it in the Western Hemisphere. Obviously, clean, green energy is another big point. That's why we are doing now the whole solar stuff, why we're moving away from traditional energy sources. And this is working, but not, you know, at such a great extent yet, because the infrastructure it takes to make it happen is enormous. I don't think that we can't make it happen, but it's just going to require a lot more time. A definite reason, okay, is that we are overpopulated. As of right now, there is 7.8 billion people on the planet. Population growth has been more extreme in some countries than others. Population in Middle Eastern countries has probably increased the most, but we're now seeing places like China and India where the population is declining. As it is in Western countries, I mean, people from Western countries, they don't want to have kids anymore. But still, there's a lot of people migrating to these countries, so the population grows. All these things that we have discussed until now have to do with what's happening in the world. The global reset has a lot to do with emissions, has a lot to do with the debt crisis, has a lot to do with inequality. I mean, these are issues that we're having right now. Okay, let's have a look at how each part of the world has handled this current crisis. Now we're talking about the pandemic, we're not talking about the global reset. If we take a look at Asia, Asia has shut its doors for the most part since the pandemic started. It's been fairly difficult to get into the continent. I know there are countries that have recently opened up, including Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Singapore. These places are open, but it is everything but easy to get into these countries. In some instances, you need to have travel insurance, you need to be vaccinated, you need to have provided a negative PCR test, and you need to be okay with doing further testing upon arrival, health insurance, whatever. You know, there's all these requirements that you need to fulfill before you can get into Southeast Asian countries, or I would say any Asian country right now, that a lot of people say, hey, you know what, I don't want to go for this process because it's too much hassle, and just to go on a vacation or just to spend a couple months in Asia, it is just not worth it. The juice is not worth the squeeze anymore. Asia has handled it in a very strict manner. Like I said, they've closed its borders and have really restricted also their own citizens from leaving the country, from coming back into the country. And let's not even talk about foreigners. Like, it was very restricted, and it is still very restricted. It's gotten a little bit better, but it's still extremely restricted in many places. Europe's response was not as tough, I'd want to say, because, you know, if you're from a European country, you were allowed to travel to other countries, not during the past 18 months. I mean, not during the whole period. There was a time when even, let's say, a Spanish citizen was not allowed to get into Portugal, was not allowed to get into France, not into Germany. But things have stabilized right now with you being vaccinated, with you having a negative PCR test before flying out. You are allowed into other European countries if you're an EU citizen. I mean, things have opened up fairly well right now in Europe, I want to say. And Europe is again welcoming tourists from outside of the continent as well. So if you are, let's say, from Asia, if you are from a country that is on the green list, you can travel to Europe. Americans, Canadians are also welcome in Europe again. And I think starting January 2022, Latin Americans, so if you're from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, you're also allowed to come to Europe again, but there are some requirements that you have to meet. Latin America's response was pretty interesting because it is one of the few regions in the world that was not as closed as others. And right now, if you want to go to Latin America, there's plenty of places where you can go to and not really have to provide much at all. Latin America was one of the places that took a fairly relaxed stance when it comes to the pandemic. And right now, if you want to go to Latin America, you can simply go to many countries without needing a negative PCR test, without being vaccinated, without health insurance, without any trouble really. You can just book a flight, fill out a health form, and travel to certain countries. America's response was also, we're just shut down the border. We don't let any tourists in. There have been times when the border was open a little bit to certain nationals like Mexicans, but for the most part, America's borders were closed. Since November 8th, Europeans are welcome in the US again. The last place I wanted to talk with you about is Australia, because Australia took the toughest stance out of all the places in the entire world, in my personal opinion. Like, didn't allow their own citizens to come back into the country, neither were their own citizens allowed to leave the country. It was a very difficult time. It's still very restricted in Australia. You know, they're having more and more lockdowns. Anytime there's an outbreak, they're shutting things down again. Being in Australia is everything but easy. And I have a lot of Australian friends that had a lot of problems there. As you can see, there have been places that have taken different approaches, but what you really want to consider right now, this is what you want to do right now, is to really come up with a game plan for yourself. And the game plan you need to come up for yourself is really whatever you want it to be, right? If you are vaccinated, you're going to have more options than someone who is unvaccinated. You know, that's just the name of the game right now. The vaccinated, if you have a vaccine pass, you're going to get in many places that an unvaccinated person can't get access to. There's still a lot of other requirements. In many cases, you need to get the PCR test done, fill out health forms and health insurance and whatever else is required to get into certain places. But really consider your game plan. If you have no problem following in line And if you have no problem getting vaccinated every other year or sometimes once or twice a year, you know, you're gonna have it easier than someone that's like, okay, I'm happier staying in a place where I don't need to be vaccinated in order to, you know, travel, in order to just go to work. There is a possibility that only vaccinated people will be allowed to travel in the future to certain places. I mean, it is already the case right now. We don't know how the whole situation is gonna pan out because there's so many unknown variables involved that it's impossible to tell. But we have seen places that enforce lockdowns for the unvaccinated, and we've seen places that put restrictions on unvaccinated, such as, you know, only being allowed to go to the grocery store or go to work. But the whole point here is really to find a way of life, okay? A way of living through this new period that suits you. And there's nobody that can advise you on that, because there's many ways on how you can proceed with this, as much as there were a ton of ways on how you could have lived before this whole period started. So I'm not here to advise you. I'm just telling you to find a way that works for you personally, something that you are at ease with, something that you're gonna be happy with. So you really have to ask yourself, do I wanna be in a place that is not gonna put so many restrictions, so many lockdowns in place? And you can really kind of make that judgment by taking a look at the past and see how certain places managed the situation over the past 18 months. And then you can say, okay, this place, they kind of took a fairly relaxed approach, fairly relaxed stance, and it's been like this throughout the whole pandemic. Then what are the odds that this place will retain their stance, will retain this routine? This is something you have to consider, right? But if you have been in a place that's been constantly changing, you know, restrictions, lockdowns, forbidding you, for instance, to leave the country, or, you know, you had a really hard time, you know, getting out of the country, or whatever problems were associated with the country you're in, you have to ask yourself, you know, if you're okay living this way, if you didn't mind, you know, if you are okay with it, then that's probably fine, I guess. However, I know for some people, they want to be in a place that is more relaxed, you know, where they know, okay, things are more predictable. It's not going to be so restricted. And that's something you really have to decide for yourself. What are your thoughts on the global reset, and where are you located in the world today? Leave a comment below and let us know. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm uploading new videos on digital nomad locations, travel updates, and visas several times a week right now. Before I let you go, I got 3 recommendations for you. Recommendation 1, I wrote a completely free ebook on how you can retain a life of freedom during challenging times, meaning the times that we're in right now. If you want to grab a completely free copy of this ebook, then all you need to do is click on the link below the video. Recommendation 2, I shot a video on the best places to live on Earth. If you want to check out this video, click right here. And recommendation 3, I shot another video on countries with easy residence permits. Check out this video now. Thank you for watching.